Greetings on behalf of Bhavan's SPJIMR. Welcome to another webinar from the Center for Financial Studies. The intent of these webinars is to hear and learn from leading experts as we continue on SPJIMR's journey to create knowledge and influence practice. The topic of today's webinar is Revival of India's Economy. And I have the pleasure of formally introducing my very well-known distinguished fellow panelists and our equally well-known moderator. I'm going to do them a grave injustice, keeping this intro really brief so that we can dive into the panel discussion right away. Dr. Pranab Sen is currently the director of the IGC India program. He was formerly the chief statistician of India, the first chief statistician of India. He's one of India's leading macroeconomists and statisticians, and his name is associated with many, many committees and commissions. I'm not going to list them out. He's also a fantastic teacher, and many of us consider ourselves to be his Ekalavyas. Dr. Ratin Roy is currently Director and CEO of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP. Like Dr. Sen, his name is associated with many committees and commissions, too numerous to list out. And till recently, till some time back, he was a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council as well. He's a leading voice on applied macroeconomics and fiscal policy. And when he talks, we all listen. Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran is an accomplished practitioner. He's worked in UBS and Credit Suisse and in Julius Baer. And he's also a fantastic teacher. He's currently a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So if you have any suggestions, you know whom to apply them to. He's again been part of many boards and committees. He's an incredible reader and a storehouse of knowledge. His blog, the Gold Standard site, it features as one of the best economic blogs worldwide. We also have Ira Tummel. She's the editor and arguably the best known face in this lot. She's the editor, Banking, Finance and Economy at Bloomberg Quint. She recently celebrated 20 years in journalism. Many rate her as the best anchor, commentator and thought leader in her field today. Ira, thanks a lot for being here. We couldn't have asked for a better moderator for this excellent panel. My name is Anant Narayan, and I'm associate professor at SPJIMR. I have the fantastic privilege today of joining this very, very eminent panel for what will hopefully be a great set of discussions. Ira, all over to you. The baton is yours now.
All right. Thanks so much, Anant, and thanks to the wonderful panel for being here. A panel like this, typically I wouldn't waste their time asking them about the here and now. The idea would be to get deeper thoughts into what the Indian economy needs to do to try and move ahead from a pre-COVID slowdown worsened by sharp contraction in the COVID period. But unfortunately, we are in a situation where the damage remains work in progress. The government's response remains work in progress. So I am going to start by bringing focus to the here and now immediately for a little bit of this conversation. And I'll start with Dr. Sen because he's done an extensive 5-part series on Ideas for India where he has given out his framework of assessing the damage. Dr. Sen, some of us are tracking the concurrent indicators which showed a pick up to about say 70-75% of activity levels, and then has shown a predictable flattening out and a little bit of a decline as well in recent weeks. Does your analytical framework continue to suggest a very deep contraction in the real GDP numbers for India? And then afterthought of that, is absolutely obvious that the government's response remains inadequate?
Well, let me begin by saying that what you should expect to observe is that if you go by growth rates, you should expect growth rates to climb secularly over the next 3 to 4 quarters. And that would be extremely misleading. I mean, if you think that that is then the precursor of a complete revival, you would be wrong. Because what you really need to track are the absolute values. So what you're going to get is the first quarter of the year, which will be terrible, depending on who you believe in. My estimate is about minus 25%. It'll improve to about minus 5%. It'll go into positive territory next calendar year, right? Now, that doesn't mean we are out of the woods. Because what will happen and what would have been happening all the time that the level of GDP will still be significantly below the levels we had attained in 2019-20. So my first advice is please track the absolute numbers. Do not, for God's sake, get excessively focused on growth rates, because that's going to be very misleading. Now, as far as the government's response is concerned, I think the government has been extremely proactive. It's been very, very quick in responding to the immediate challenge. And the immediate challenge was that because of the lockdown, you had a situation where companies were in a, not just companies, I mean, this is all production enterprises who were in the non-essential sector, were in a situation where they couldn't produce and therefore couldn't generate any income whatsoever. Now, if that is the case, you have a situation that if they have to continue to service their debts, they would become NPAs within the lockdown period. Now, the government, the RBI in particular, RBI acted very quickly, and then the government backstopped them with guarantees, acted very quickly on this, and I think it saved a lot of companies up to this point. The second step is that once the lockdown is lifted, you need to be able to provide these companies with sufficient liquidity so that they're able to resume production, because they will have to have a lot of startup costs that will have to be borne, and they simply will not have the funds for it. Now, some of that has already been provided in these 20 lakh crore announcement, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, particularly the 3 lakh crore provision for MSMEs, which is 100% guaranteed by the government. The problem, of course, in that is the discretion is left to banks.
Yep.
Now, the banking sector has been risk averse well before COVID even began, was even thought of. And COVID has created a degree of uncertainty where everybody in the economy has very high levels of uncertainty. And in the case of the banking sector, it is uncertainty loaded onto already existing uncertainty. So their willingness to lend to anybody except their very, very best clients is going to be low.
Yes.
The million-dollar question, of course, is that what proportion of the economy do their very, very best clients account for? And I suspect it would be pretty small.
Dr. Sen, we will, sort of discuss some of these aspects in greater detail. If I can just widen out the conversation and then come to them step by step. Dr. Roy, you had undertaken an analytical exercise as well, an article that you published. You looked at it from the perspective of nominal GDP, but were your broad findings similar to what Dr. Sen is saying, that if you look at levels, it is going to take a while for us to even get back to 2019-20 levels, and we will continue to see deep contraction at least the first 2 quarters, nominal terms and real terms this year?
You're in mute, Dr. Roy.
Sorry about that. So let me first say that yes, of course, my exercise is in concordance with what Pranab did. There's a second version coming out, which is a little more optimistic day after tomorrow. But nevertheless, we are looking at double-digit declines in nominal growth rates this year. It's a worst-case scenario. So what I did was I looked at the extent to which on the demand side, loss of income led to a reduction in demand. And looking across the 3 sort of macro sectors and foreign trade activity. So while the current account deficit is positive, the fact that your trading activity is smaller, X minus N, means less demand from that source. And the government on track record was not going to be boosting demand simply because much of its fiscal deficit action so far would basically make up for the shortfall in tax revenues, which is also a consequence of falling incomes and consumption. So if you look at it that way, then I was getting a fairly large, around 15-14% fall in the nominal growth rate. On the supply side, I calculated what I call restoration ratios. So on current information available inductively, what proportion of agricultural output, primary sector output, organized manufacturing output, unorganized manufacturing output, informal services and formal services would be restored and by when. So you get different timelines for each of these, but broadly speaking, that said that it would be about 2%. The nominal fall then, if there had been no demand shock, would have been about 2% less than the demand side. So if you look at those two, then basically you would assume that supply would adjust to demand. And that's a positive on this. But even if you add that positive on, my worst case scenario would be a double-digit fall of between 12 and 14%, depending on what happens to inflation. Now, today's inflation numbers are encouraging. If those hold for the year, then the fall would be in single digits. Obviously, it's nominal, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm in broad concordance with him. And I'd like to emphasize that we are facing a very odd shock here. The shock has happened on the supply side because people have been unable to produce. And simultaneously, there's a shock on the demand side because people are unable to earn incomes, especially in the informal sector. That restoration in the supply side will not bring about a pari passu restoration of incomes and consumption unless something happens going forward. And therefore, we are going to look at a negative shock this year. And if you write that in a multi-period, then if you have a negative shock this year, for that negative shock to restore 1920 levels of supply and demand next year is highly unlikely, again, unless something happens in terms of policy interventions. So I'm looking at negative growth this year and mildly negative growth next year unless inflation blesses us. But that carries its own set of problems. We can take that up later. And sort of recovery in 21-22 also will depend for me finally on a very key question: to what extent does the output composition of demand and supply change in response to the crisis? Simple example: if the total contribution of healthcare in 21-22 is much greater than it was in 1920, we will have a better recovery than if it remained the same. Thanks.
Fair enough. Dr. Nageshwaran, I'll put the same question to you, although I do want to encourage the panelists to jump in as they feel necessary. Let's, the idea
Let
is to
everybody
encourage
have their
debate.
say first. Then we'll,
Yes.
we'll tear each other up.
All right. Dr. Nageshwaran, do you have a slightly more optimistic view of the world or view of India?
No, I think it will be difficult for me to contradict both my panelists who went before me.
Ananta, I can't hear you properly. Can you come closer to the mic, please?
Sure. No, I was just saying that, are you able to hear me better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was just saying that it will be difficult for me to contradict both the panelists who went before me for the simple reason that I don't have a model of my own to be able to say that I have an alternative estimate. And I, just as you did, I had also finished reading Dr. Sen's 5-part article, which was also a great paper, giving us a good context into the post-2008 and post-2016 demonetization, growth outcomes, etc. So I think, also the optimistic scenario would be what the consensus is saying, which is that a real GDP contraction of -5 to -6%. So, of course, I saw the NCAER estimate, which is plus 1.3%, and I'm still sort of trying to grapple with the numbers to be able to see where they get it. But I think Dr. Sen's point is very well taken, because we know that if you have a 40% drop from a baseline number, and then you even grow by 30% afterwards, you are still going to be down by 22% from the original situation that you were in. So I think the question is therefore focusing on how soon or how sustainably you can return to the 2020 number. So I would go with the numbers that are already out there, and I don't have an alternative optimistic or pessimistic number to offer you as a counterpoint here at this stage.
All right. Professor Narayan, slightly, a question with a twist to you, because, you keep us all honest. Now, what we're hearing from Dr. Sen, Dr. Roy, Professor Dr. Nageshwaran, is something that we have now been discussing for, well, a good 2 months, right? I mean, from -5 to -6 to -10, the numbers have been, going up and down. Have we seen a commensurate sort of acceptance of this reality within government, within policymakers, which then spurs a set of actions?
Great question, Neera. So let me just add to what the distinguished voices said before me. I use my crazy little Excel spreadsheet as well. It is no way as intricate as the exercise that Dr. Sen or Dr. Roy did. I used a simple input-output table and used a bit of pull out of thin air numbers as well. But very straightforward, given the level of lockdown and the fact that big parts of the economy were visibly closed between March 25th. Of course, they progressively opened up in stages, April 20th, May 3rd, June 3rd, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, vast parts of the economy were still closed. Even now, we've not come back anywhere close to full 100% GDP. Given all of that, mathematically, I tend to agree with the numbers given by Dr. Sen and Dr. Roy. I think we see a double-digit contraction for FY21. It will take a lot of inputs in terms of policy and actual money being spent to repair that and to change that. So we are looking at a double-digit contraction, I think. The consequences of that, I think, are also important. Of course, there's an impact on employment. But as Dr. Sen was saying, because of some timely government intervention, particularly ramping up Mahatma Gandhi Narega, as well as the fact that Food Corporation of India is now sitting on record stocks, a lot of procurement has happened, and monsoons seem to be doing us a good turn. All of that, I think, as the CMI reports also indicate, is giving some relief on the employment front. But it's not restored employment; it is makeshift employment in lieu of what's been lost, right? For businesses, there's been a lot of losses. I mean, if you have a double-digit contraction, that's a body blow to an already weak economy at multiple fronts. So, we talk about 63 million micro, small, and medium enterprises. At least anecdotal evidence suggests that a big chunk of them, maybe even 20% of them, could be facing an existential crisis in some form or shape. And I don't think, frankly, that's getting resolved just by a provision of liquidity. And what does that mean for the banking sector? Banking sector and the financial services ecosystem anyway was sitting on large non-performing assets. That number could go up to anything close to 18 to 20% of advances if this thing pans out the way it's panning out. What does it mean for fiscal deficit? We could be looking at a center plus state fiscal deficit of upwards of, I think, 14% of GDP. I think more packages will come through. And the fact is our tax collections are collapsing, given there's no economic activity. Plus, of course, the denominator itself in terms of GDP is coming down. So all of this is kind of going against us. There will be monetization. RBI is monetizing. It will continue to monetize. So that's the broad picture I get. Now, in terms of is there an acknowledgement of that? I think there is. While people might not be as blunt with the numbers as we're all being here, I think there's a broad acknowledgement that this is possibly the biggest economic crisis that we've seen in our lifetime. Certainly, I've seen in my lifetime. Now, is the response commensurate to that? Look, I put it into two levels. As Dr. Sen said, I think after probably a slow start, the response we've seen in terms of Narega picking up, numbers from the Narega website show 37,000 crores have been spent. That's 37% of the full year budget until the June quarter itself. And looks like even July is continuing in the same vein. Plus, Food Corporation of India, as I said, is sitting on 97 million tons of stock now. They've procured a lot of food grains despite COVID-19. So all of that is clearly helping at an area which is good. Rural economy, and a lot of questions come up as to why are we giving largest to rural economy. I think that's the only sector which is not impacted by COVID-19. So if you have any hope of spending coming through, it's the rural economy. So that's good. Where I think we've not smelt the coffee as yet, the pain that businesses are going through, giving them liquidity by way of 3 lakh crores, etc., is not enough. Their bottom lines are hurting. They're having an existential crisis. There, I think the relief is inadequate, and hopefully the next round of relief measures will be concentrating on them. Besides, of course, whoever is having a humanitarian or an economic distress in terms of livelihoods.
Dr. Roy, so Dr. Sen was talking about the immediate response, but let me ask you, the immediate response had some cash transfers, had food transfers, had an sort of upped budget on the Narega side. The food transfers have been extended. That was sort of a no-brainer given the stocks we had. The cash transfers have not, and Manrega, the demand is already running well ahead of the supply. So even in terms of putting a floor on the damage, do we need a second round before we start talking about repairing the damage?
I don't know, but you're right when you say damage, because let us be clear that the measures that you mentioned were not measures to stimulate demand. They were relief measures, just like you have in a flood or something. And I don't know what the disaster management situation is at present, and that those relief measures need to be continued or not.
Dr. Sen, would you have liked to see at least the cash transfers continue? Although I know that would have meant an immediate sort of acceptance of the fiscal expansion?
You're on mute, sir.
You're on mute, sir.
Unmuted. Yeah, I mean, let's be very clear. First of all, the cash transfers were a good idea, but the amounts were a joke. 500,000 rupees for a person who has lost his job doesn't even cover 3 days. So what does he do for the remaining 27? It should have been at least 3,000 to 4,000 for it to have made sense, both in terms of what Rotin said, which is as a relief measure. And you would need to go above that if you wanted it as a demand stimulus measure. Okay, you are well below that. So let's not even talk about it as a stimulus of any variety. The question is, do we need a stimulus? And the answer is yes. You know, this is what Anant was talking about. The basic problem now is what is going to happen to businesses. We are now in a situation where lockdown is lifted, but demand doesn't exist. And if this demand constraint binds for an extended period of time, what you're going to see is a bloodbath among the MSMEs. And this is the point that Anant was making, I think. Now, if you do see that, then you're looking at a situation where towards the end of this calendar year, maybe very early next calendar year, we'll be back to a supply constraint, not because there's a lockdown, but because capacities have simply closed. And then demand can increase however much you like, and all that will happen is that either you'll get imports or you'll get inflation. So the real message that one would like to convey is perhaps you're doing a leap of faith. I'm talking to the government now, but please, if you have to do any demand stimulus, do it now. Don't do it 3 months later because you may have well missed the bus.
Dr. Nageshwaran, already running late, not even on, the reason I was focusing on the cash transfers because my point is that you haven't even completed the repair part of this exercise, leave alone the stimulus part. But it seems like, it's getting later and later in the year and it becoming more and more immediate to come out with that package, which may have a repair component and a stimulus component.
No, I heard Dr. Sen quite clearly. So yeah, sometimes you have to have a leap of faith and take an action. And I think this is a kind of action that you can roll back in case it turns out to have been unnecessary. So from that point of view, I'm just trying to sort of do some, why is the government hesitating? Or is the government being somewhat cautious in providing demand stimulus? So clearly the events in the border with China showed us that the government was probably right in preserving some firepower because of the additional defense spending now that will be required. So to that extent, their caution was vindicated. But you look at the GST collection in June, which looked like just about 10 to 20% short of the normal month. But then you also had the market IHS Business Outlook survey, which was the worst in 11 years. So you have to balance the two. And as Anant very eloquently put it, support given to the businesses right from the beginning has been somewhat on the parsimonious side. So, and I think I would go with the risk management approach, and that would favor what Dr. Sen said. You can err on the side of being somewhat liberal because I think you can always roll it back. So in that sense, if you think in a risk management framework, then the answer becomes obvious.
Dr. White?
No, I actually want to come in and make a point for your audience which may not be apparent. While I would have preferred a very different approach to this problem right from the beginning, as I've written about, massive income support and massive support to prevent asset destruction, there is a logic in this approach. And the key to that logic is in understanding why is the RBI, to quote Sherlock Holmes, the only dog, or misquote Sherlock Holmes, that is barking so hard in the night time. That's not typical. Typically, finance ministries bark and central banks follow. All the barking is being done by the central bank. Then you ask, if the barking is done by the central bank and the sort of Mahabharat, mini Mahabharat 5-day, how do I put it, elocution that we had to go through from the finance minister, focus mainly on credit policy and monetary policy measures, other than honey and beekeeping, then I have to ask myself what is the logic, and I'll tell you what I think it is. If this were the UK 1985, and if by some miracle the Prime Minister, I know it's not Anand, had an advisor in his PMEAC who was an unreconstructed Thatcherite, then this is exactly what he would do. Because he would say very clearly that the state has no business interfering in business. Business must stand on its own feet, become what? Atmanirbhar. And to do that, if the state has to suspend some rules like collateral, provide credit in ample measure, increase liquidity, we will do that for you. But the business of dealing with demand and supply and keeping your business going, you have to do. And if you can't do it and burn, tough. Others will come in through creative destruction and the economy will rejuvenate. Government's job is to provide the ability for businesses to deal with situations. And then if you add to the fact that somewhat puzzlingly to many, but now I think this must be the only logical explanation, like Sherlock Holmes. Why would a government that was not, influenced by media and Narasimha Rao and all that, start announcing long-term reform measures in that 5-day elocution? It didn't make any sense right there, but there is a logic to it. Because what the government is also signaling to you is, we are signaling to you our intention of significantly withdrawing from the business of productive asset management. That is the public sector. We are going to be privatizing. We are going to be making it very easy for you to buy these things. We are going to be delisting FDs from the stock exchange. So they're going to give you a rules network and an asset space to grow. But what you have to do to grow, don't look at the taxpayer for support. If that is the government's, I am inferring the government's intention. The government has not said so. They have just come and given me a 5-day elocution and then radio silence. If that is indeed the government's, strategic approach to this, then it would follow that to do massive income support now on top would be a great mistake. Once you have chosen your path, you must walk it. And if this is the path the government has chosen, then we all have to walk it, and we have to endure the process of creative destruction going forward. What we have to look to government to do is to speedily implement these regulatory reform measures, announce its privatization program without worrying about what people will say about underselling or underbuying of assets, ignore the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, and proceed along the path that this mythical Thatcherite sage seems to have laid out for government. Thank you.
Dr. Nageshwaran, your recent blog was titled, Do States, Markets, Institutions and Literacy Matter as much as we think, or does stuff happen? Was the subtext in that blog somewhere in keeping with what Dr. Roy said?
I read that.
So, I think that was more of it does have some resonance to the current situation, but but it's more of a blue sky thinking. So his point is that was the government in effect saying, of course, as he put it correctly, the government didn't come out and articulate to the extent that he articulated, that is that, we are going to sort of make it easy for you to take over the commanding heights of the economy, and we're going to get out of the way, and therefore you manage both the upside and the downside yourself, and we will just do some minor facilitation through the credit and the liquidity. And so if it was articulated that way, then obviously I think the business also would be aware of what to expect and what not to expect. Of course, I will even add to his point. In September, well before the COVID happened, the government announced the tax cuts, corporate tax cuts, extending it to all businesses, which is also a supply side measure. But I think whether the government has an attitude that Dr. Roy so eloquently elaborated or not is something that I think it needs to be made explicit so that businesses know what to expect and what not to expect. But right now the feeling is that they are in a bit of a limbo. And also I would say philosophies are all right, because the conservative government of 2020 is doing something very different what the conservative government of 1985 would have never contemplated doing. So every ideology has its context, and I think that's exactly what the blog post was trying to convey, because I don't think these things are really cast in stone or should be cast in stone. I think that the context will determine what is the right approach to follow. So from that perspective, I would even argue this being an extraordinary situation, I would say supply side measures, privatization, etc., all very welcome, very preferable from the long-term point of view. But in the short term, there is room for support, but with quid pro quo, in the sense of performance obligation, similar to what East Asia did back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. You give support, but you demand productivity and export growth, etc., or governance, whatever it is. So I think there is a room for some sort of a via media between active demand management and a hands-off attitude, just clearing the ground for them to grow, because right now that probably isn't going to help. So I'll just leave it there.
Professor Narayan, you want to pick up from there? I saw you shaking your head, so I assume you agree at least with the part that there is some intervention still to come and necessary.
Oh, absolutely. So look, I'll try and break this up into 2 or 3 parts. On, do we need more relief going through? Look, initially, I think the government started off on a very weak note. There was simply not enough relief going through, particularly with the migrant workers going through the chaos that they did. I think it was a terrible time. Subsequently, though, if I look at simply the unemployment numbers coming out from CMIE, combination of NREGA, combination of a good harvesting season or a good sowing season going through seems to be playing out. The other big thing, which I think is doing a lot in terms of relief that you alluded to, Ira, is the fact that we now have food security. Now, we can argue about how efficient is everybody that deserves it getting it, etc. By and large, in the rural areas, at least, it seems to be working. At least that's what the research indicates. So, it might not be 800 million people, but whatever number of people are getting food security, 5 kgs of grains till November, I think that's a great relief as well, right? Where I think relief is still required is probably for the urban unemployed, and ways in which you get back unemployed or people to move back into the urban areas for employment eventually. I think that's the area where questions remain. On businesses, to the point that Dr. Roy made and to the point that Professor Van made, let's think about what the concerns could be about giving relief to bottom lines of businesses. Again, this is relief. This is not about demand stimulus. One is, of course, how do you give it in a country like India? Sure, we're becoming more formalized. There is more database available, but how do you dole out money to whom? Everybody is clamoring for relief. Real estate sector, auto sector, export sector, everybody is clamoring for relief. How do you dole this out, right? Second thing is, you don't want to be called a Sood Boot Ki Sarkar, which means you give out relief to somebody, it's a big man, and then everybody pounces on you saying, you're doing the wrong things. So one way to probably address this is look at what everybody is looking at, which is the MSME sector. And for the en masse, the entire MSME sector, try and see if you can give some relief. And one area which I think even people like Dr. Rakesh Mohan have talked about is giving interest subvention, right? You essentially, if you have 20 lakh crores of outstanding MSME loans, 3 months, 6 months, say, entire interest, I'll take on the burden. It's not a big deal. It's if it's 20 lakh crores for 6 months, let's say 10% interest rate, you're looking at 1 lakh crores. That's nothing. It's something we can easily live with. So maybe that kind of stuff would probably be doable. Now that's for the relief part. On demand and stimulus, look, it's a medical question. We have to first come to a situation where we are in a position to consume, which means money coming into our hands. All of us on this chat should be in a position to go out and consume, right? That's a medical question, unfortunately, out of syllabus, out of our hands. As and when we hopefully come to the stage where spending is coming back into normal, I would strongly argue that any fiscal stimulus for demand has to be accompanied by what Anant was mentioning, which is you have to have output going up as well. We can't have countenance a situation where what we've been doing for the last 10, 15 years continues, which is you put money in the hands of people, fine, but most of the consumption is being met by imports. Your consumption as a percentage of GDP, the imports net trade deficit as a percentage of GDP keeps going up. It's now, between 7 to 8%, which is a very, very high number. It used to be 1 or 2% till 20 years ago. You can't have a situation where we are simply not producing enough for ourselves. If you give money in the hands of people where we are not, creating proper jobs and proper output, you will lead to all the financial stability issues that Dr. Sen and Dr. Roy mentioned, which is inflation, currency weaknesses, and all of that. We need both to go together. You have to have a demand stimulus along with taking steps to ensure that output can follow. And I will submit at this juncture, there are serious structural impediments which come in the way of creation of sustainable jobs and output. There's a long, long way to go. It's not just about the fisc. It's about those real economy reforms to ensure jobs and output can follow.
Okay, and I think
There's one minor fiscal point I'd like to very quickly add, if I may. Uh, See, I think by now, 7 years into government, I think the Prime Minister and his political colleagues have a fairly good idea about the quality and capability of the central government civil service in delivering things. They can order people about, they can issue notifications, they don't regulate very well. But when it comes to income transfers, other than this Jan Dhan business, which is actually the crudest form of income transfer, find a bank, put money, find a bank, put money. Anything slightly more sophisticated either requires you to, basically finance the states and non-central government machineries to do it, or you're going to get very ineffective implementation. If you look at all centrally sponsored schemes and the quality of implementation is ineffective. So then taking a precious fiscal rupee, giving it to an ineffective bureaucracy to roll out with 30-40% leakages could be terribly counterproductive. Now you can't say that in your part peroration, but I would say that that's in the backdrop. They've quietly taken a call that this public service delivery system is simply not capable of doing anything at the kind of levels of ambition that a support package would require on the demand side, and so let's not do it. Possible. I'm just, again, it's an inference, but I think it's a reasonable inference.
Okay. Dr. Sen, just coming back to the SME point, actually links into what Dr. Roy is also saying, that if you're designing relief measures via the banking system, perhaps you think that that's the best way to do it. Although, given the state of our banking system, I think Anand would certainly disagree. I would disagree as an outsider. But you wrote in your article that let's double the working capital limit. Dr. Rakesh Mohan said, let's provide subsidy to these MSMEs. The government has backstop guarantee, fairly large amount, 3 lakh crore. But my point is that the SMEs will be reluctant to take on debt if they are uncertain about their business. Is debt the solution in a situation like this?
No, that is precisely the point I think we've been trying to make, which is that the liquidity support that is being given is just to keep the businesses alive until they're ready to start. The question that you're asking is really the legitimate question, which is, when will they be ready to start? When will they think that, okay, I think we can now begin production because we'll be able to sell the stuff that we make. Now that really is the critical issue. And that's where the whole demand part of the problem crops up. Now, the question as to how to do it, Rosin has already talked about the politics of fiscal stimulus. And I think he has a point there. Because fiscal stimulus can be of various kinds. The main one, as Rosin said, is that the delivery system in government is predominantly in the hands of the state. But the states don't have the money to do a fiscal stimulus. The money has to come from the center. The problem that Rosin is trying to point out, and he's done it very delicately, I'll be more blunt, is who gets the political benefit. Is it the state government or is it the center? Now, if you actually route it through the states, then the center runs the risk of having footed the bill and got no credit for it. And if the center tries to do it on its own, then as Rosin quite rightly said, and I've been in the central government for many, many years, they'd make a complete hash of it. But the one thing that the central government can do, and they can do it directly, is what Anand talked about, which is essentially support the enterprises themselves, which is why their focus and their hope is we will support the enterprises and then hope like hell that the demand will emerge somehow. There'll be some kind of a trickle-down effect playing out. Unfortunately, that is not something that is likely to happen.
Interestingly, I'm just sort of glancing at the comments. So a couple of them, we'll address them perhaps in the course of them. One of them is, trickle-down economics. Let's give up on that, and let's perhaps, as a corollary, have more directed relief stimulus to sectors. And the other one is that should we move more towards the states to provide relief? Do they have better machinery? Dr. Nageshwaran, do you want to pick up on both this absolutely large problem of how do you design relief for private enterprises who may need very different things, sector to sector, company to company, and if that's not an option, then do you just do a large government public works program, either to the central government or a combination of central and state?
No, I think, again, Dr. Roy made a very important observation, again, inferring from the government's reluctance to spend money through the bureaucracy. And I find that inference a lot more plausible than the first one, which he mentioned about the philosophical reason being somewhat reluctant to provide support.
I'm just trying to find some strategic rationale for what this government
Absolutely.
does.
I mean, so we're all absolutely. So no, I think that is par for the course, and that's what this discussion is all about. So if that is the case, then we should still stick to the liquidity support framework, low interest rate or interest rate subvention. And I go back to the 3 lakh crores support. Now, you take a look at the document that CRISIL produced way back in end of April. They looked at 40,000 companies, and the total employee cost of them was close to about the total, if I'm not mistaken, revenues were about 11 lakh crores. 8% of that constituted basically their the first 70% of those companies were below 100 crores, and they only had 88,000 crores of annual employee cost. So a 3 lakh crore government guaranteed credit facility more than provides for companies with 100 crore turnover to pay for 1 year of employee cost. You could have extended, one could extend that credit facility all the way up to companies with 500 crores or 1,000 crores, and the 3 lakh crores would still be adequate. Then the question is whether the 9% interest rate that is being charged on this is the right interest rate, or should it be even lower at 7%? Therefore, my point is, I don't think the government, given the budget situation that it faces, is in a position to give outright grants and therefore, incur on budget fiscal deficit, because forget about the credit rating agencies. If the bond market continued to react as the way it did in the month of March for developing economies, we are all now speaking with the benefit of hindsight that the bond market yield is 5.8% for the 10-year treasury. Suppose the reaction was very different, regardless of what the credit rating agencies did, then we could say that government would be undoing its work if the sovereign borrowing cost went up. And then it would spill over into private sector borrowing cost as well. So I think the liquidity route is a compromise. The question is, could it have been extended to more enterprises given the size of the amount in place? So I would argue, therefore, for continuing with the approach, but making the beneficiaries net much wider.
Professor Narayan, you want to come in?
Yeah, and do call me Anantya. I don't know who Professor Narayan is, to be honest. So here is a quick rejoinder. Look, if I was my old bank, wearing my old banker hat, I would be thrilled with this government guaranteed, 3 lakh crore measure, because it allows me to top up whoever I've lent money to by 20%, earn the interest, and somebody else is bearing the credit risk. So I would be thrilled. Would the company be thrilled? Not really. Because as you were making the point, Ira, effectively you're increasing your debt burden. It doesn't matter what the interest rate is, whether it's 9%, 6%, 7%, you're still bearing a cost. So your problem is you don't have a top line. Your bottom line has gone deeply red, and you're being offered debt. That's hardly a relief or a solution for the companies on the ground, which is why I'm saying the relief required is to the bottom line, to the profit and loss, where Dr. Rakesh Mohan's idea of complete interest rate subvention, not just for this 3 lakh crores, but for the entire 20 lakh crores or whatever that number is of bank and NBFC loans to MSME, would be in order. Now, look, Anand has a good point. It's nice to say, all of us will stand up and say, I want this, I want that. We can ask for the moon, sun, moon, everything put together. There's a limited room. So how do you decide what is required and what can we afford, what can't we afford? As you rightly pointed out, what is required in terms of survival and support for basic requirements has to be provided for, right? So we agreed, for instance, that people who have lost their jobs you have to make sure that basic essential requirements are being met, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's housing and security and of that kind, right? Likewise, for businesses, if there are businesses which are going to face existential crisis, it's no longer about just being humanitarian. It's also, for financial stability of our own economy. As Dr. Sen was saying, 1 year later, if they all go belly up, we won't have supply. We won't have an infrastructure available to create output, right? So it's in our interest, therefore, to ensure that we provide some kind of support. Now, it's also possible support that you provide goes to people who don't require it. Lots of MSMEs, by the way, are not necessarily bleeding. They're in the right sectors, so they, pharma or medical enterprises or whatever, so they might be doing well, right? It's okay. So even if you give money to people who don't deserve it, part of it will come back by way of taxes. And B, by the way, let's not nitpick. If some people get it who don't deserve it, that's fine. Let's move on. So I think that part, it should be clear that some amount of relief is absolutely essential to preserve financial stability going forward. The last bit I will add is, I think as we decide and do more of these relief measures to provide support, it's absolutely important that we have a medium-term plan in place as to how are we going to grow out of this. The more clarity you have around the plan about how you are eventually going to create jobs and output, and as Dr. Atin Roy is fond of saying, expand the number of consumers from beyond the 150 million people and make it a more broad-based set of jobs and output. If you have a decent, cogent plan, which we can all believe in, and we believe we're moving in that direction, that will give us a lot more confidence of being able to provide support right now.
Dr. Sen, I still think that the question of how you design support for larger enterprises has not been answered. So I'm going to persist on that question for you, because it's easier said than done. And I am going to add on my second part as well, that given what we know of multipliers, et cetera, is a large government public works program perhaps, the easier option right now?
It's not a question of whether it's easy. Look, large government work programs are not easy by any means. They require managerial capacity, which would strain seriously the capabilities of both the center and the state. So let's not kid ourselves that that's going to be easy. The point is, again, I think, as Anand said, about the Rothian's whole issue of widening the consumer base. So if you think about widening the consumer base, then what you're really talking about is being able to provide income to those who would be the next rung of consumers. So you're taking it from the 150 million to, let's say, 300 million, and so on. Public work programs, properly designed, are actually very good for that purpose. And the bang for the buck that you get is much larger than if you had depended only on direct transfers. That's the way you need to think of it. Now, as far as the large corporates are concerned, what is the nature of the problem? As far as any enterprise is concerned, there are two problems that they're facing. One is their ability to survive and bear the costs of survival till such time as production and sales can resume. That's problem number one. Problem number two is the uncertainty surrounding the nature of competition that they are going to face once they are open, they have started production. These are the two problems that they are facing. As far as the corporate sector is concerned, they really don't have the same degree of problem in either case. So again, if you look at the recent data, what has been happening? The large companies, particularly in the FMCG space, are actually gaining market share because the SMEs have simply stopped production, right? So their issue is much more, do they have the staying capacity? By and large, they do. There will be some of the corporates who are in the smaller category whose staying power may be limited. There will be some companies who have over-leveraged themselves, who will have a problem. And the biggest problem is going to be with those companies who have very high exposure to external borrowings, right? And I think on this, I would go with the unreconstructed Thatcherite approach. They met their bed, let them lie on
Okay. Dr. Roy, since you have been writing about this sort of producing output that can be sold to a wider sort of set of Indians, you've been writing on this approach for a while. Does this pivot happen organically? Is there a role for policy to play in this, or is this just businesses organically realizing that they need to target a different or a wider set of consumers at different price points?
No, I mean, obviously, I mean, it's important to understand there's a role not for policy. There's a role for policy, but before that, there's a need to change an attitude. And that's a very communist attitude that we have in this country, which is that you can only make money out of selling ice creams or out of producing chemicals, and or out of, selling stuff where your value margins are high. And everything else is not worth it. That whole attitude to agriculture, which I found quite disgusting since I came back to this country, which is, it's a horrible place, there are too many people hired there, and these patch statements economists make, that the problem with agriculture is you have to get people off the land. Now that's a communist statement to make. Who are you to get people off the land? Market forces decide who stays where. And I think it's quite insulting to tell people who are in agriculture that they're in agriculture because they're stupid. They're not stupid. They're in agriculture because they're satisfying a certain, maximization problem, which we all know. So therefore, there are two ways of looking at it. If agriculture, I've been trying to get a grant. Now it's too late, I've resigned. They give me grants for all sorts of things, but this fell out. I wanted to just take 13 agroclimatic zones of India and work out the EBITDAs, balance sheets, and P&L accounts of different types of farmers. Not a penny is available for that. I want to know how, whether that business makes money. Nobody's told me about that. They grow more food, how to be productive, how to use less water. It's all communism. But do they make money? Who makes money in agriculture, and how can we make them make more money? If they make more money, then agriculture would survive. I will not repeat my story about the fact that this 3,000 rupee shirt, it's an old shirt, so it looks so threadbare, is 90% made in India, Marks and Spencer, but 400 rupee shirts are made abroad. Why? What's the problem in entering the 400 rupee market? I've written extensively on this. Why is everyone so obsessed with real estate in Gurgaon? What's wrong with making 15% on 20 lakh houses? I've got solutions on that. And that would involve a policy change. For example, I have to ask the Indian Army why they really need all the land that they seem to be sitting on. It's not in Ladakh. Yeah, and it's not on the Pakistan border. It's right there in the middle of Bombay and Delhi. So I need to ask the Indian Army, what are you doing with this? Why should we be building a civilian airport 40 kilometers outside Pune, and the Indian Air Force has a giant base with its Sukhois and things 8 kilometers outside Pune? So there we have policy questions. Health and education are not charity. You can make money out of health and education. And by money, I just don't mean profit there, but there is an EBITDA to health and education, which is a reward to the economy and a reward to people. If you're healthy, you earn more money. If you're better educated, you earn more money. So imagine a situation with COVID today, if 60% of our GDP came from these 5 sectors. We would be much more resilient now than we are now. Hankering on about auto parts and automobile parts and, people repairing punctures in rural areas, etc., etc. That's the kind of economic transformation we need to be talking about. And that involves a pivot in the desire of the private sector to make money. They need to understand that there are many, many ways of making money, and they don't have that. The ability of banks to back that risk appetite to make money in places that are different from we did today, and then complementary policies from government to facilitate that. So actually what I'm arguing is for health and education and agriculture, but not the old argument. I'm arguing that we can make, GDP is making money. So let's go out and make some money from these sectors. We'll have more resilient sectors. We'll have more people consuming, a wider swathe of producers, and we'll be on our road to development transformation.
Dr. Nageswaran, the medium-term framework as we, find our way through this crisis. And I do want to just, throw in a note here. We keep coming back to that old, we can be the next China because we're going to export our way into prosperity. I mean, about time we stopped doing export-focused reports. I think I've read 10 of them in my short career. I'm sure you all have read even more. Let's think different if that hasn't worked.
No, so again, valid point and a valid question. Let me first quickly take on the 2 points made by Anant Narayan and Dr. Ratindra. I mean, if you want to make goods for the bottom 80% of the population, then it's a question of having affordable cost at which you can make them. And Anand pointed out the lack of a medium-term growth strategy. So if you can marry the two. So again, if Dr. Roy's first inference was right, that the government was merely trying to get out of the way, then the last 2 weeks, all of us might have received Team Lease's 3 images of the compliance burdens that India is facing between the union government and the state governments, compliances, laws. So clearly a policy of simply whittling away many of those unwanted rules, restrictions, and regulations would be a start. That satisfies both getting out of the way, that satisfies Anand Narayan's request for a medium-term growth strategy, and that satisfies Dr. Roy's point about how do you make goods for the bulk of the population is to reduce the cost. And then the second point is, besides these rules and regulations, the second point is about understanding that the bulk of the reforms that needs to happen lie in the realm of state governments, whether it is land, labor, education, and health. So clearly we need a certain consensus, and I think a start has to be made, committing ourselves to just 3 or 4 areas, because there is a paper out there from the Center for International Development at the Harvard University, which is a wonderful paper published almost a couple of years ago, but still very, very relevant, that you don't try and address every problem, because you need to have certain credibility, and sometimes the bandwagon effect automatically will kick in if you address few core areas. So getting the state governments to agree on 3 or 4 areas where they could reform, whether the floor space index or making the conversion of land from agriculture to non-agriculture slightly less cumbersome and less rent seeking, those are the things which will automatically create the momentum. So to Anand's point about a legitimate need for a medium-term growth strategy is to choose 2 or 3 areas for the union and the state governments, and that would also address Dr. Roy's point about making goods for everybody. To come to your point about the exports, I completely agree with you. In a situation of weak global growth and everybody trying to reshore production and becoming very nationalistic, to expect growth to be your growth drive, exports to be your growth driver, as it was between 2003 and 8, is a pipe dream. But however, this situation is about grabbing market share because the pie is not growing. And to grab export market share, you need to still emphasize on productivity and performance. That is why I said we should support the industries, but with performance quid pro quo in terms of productivity. And that is exactly taking a leaf out of the East Asia book, which is that you do support industries, but only provided they deliver. In fact, Joe Studwell put it very beautifully. They didn't support performers as much as those governments hurt the non-performers. I think that is the process to go. But otherwise, I agree with you. Emulating China from where we are with the kind of high cost of production and the legislative and the compliance burden that our businesses carry is not going to happen. So right now, that is why Vietnam and Mexico and Bangladesh are getting the industries moving out of China and not India. And we need to basically face up to the fact that we are not there yet, and it is a process, and it is not something that is driven, that is completed in 3 to 6 months, but we have to begin somewhere. Sorry about the long answer.
No, absolutely. And the reason I brought in exports was simply on the wider point that we need a slightly, reviewed thinking on our medium-term growth. But Dr. Sen, do you want to come in on this? Some of these longer-term questions which are back, and perhaps, as many keep repeating, sometimes just for the sake of it, crisis, reform, let's not waste a good crisis. Is this the moment that we start pivoting? Dr. Sen, your mic is on mute, sir.
The point is that the longer term reforms are all very well, but when you do them, needs to be in the context of where the economy is at that particular point in time. I mean, to give you an example, one of the big components of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package is really disinvestment in the PSUs. Privatization, increasing degrees of privatization. Now, this is a perfectly laudable objective, except this is not the time to do it. As it is, we are in a situation where the appetite for investment is very low. If you start, let's say, a privatization, a very strongly driven privatization process now, what you will be doing is you will be eating into whatever investment intentions there happen to exist. So people who are planning to put up a greenfield or a brownfield capacity will simply shift those resources to buying existing capacity, which doesn't add to the capacity of the economy at all, which is the way you want to go. Privatization is best done when the demand for investment opportunities is outpacing what the economy actually needs. That's when you privatize. This is the wrong time to do it. So as a menu, that's fine, but we need to be very clear that in that menu, what is the soup, what is the starter, what is the main course, and what is the dessert. Unfortunately, we've been given no indication as to whether any such prioritization, any such time phasing has been even thought about.
Dr. Nageshwaran, you have a point to make. I noticed you were smiling.
I think, no, I'm smiling because I agree with him that Dr. Sen's point that you need to sort of choose your reforms and choose what you need to do. Yes, he's right. Because even before the COVID happened, we have been struggling to privatize and attract interest for Air India. This is well before COVID happened. But as a statement of intent, as a signal, it is a valid signal to send that, you know, when things normalize, we are not looking to be an interventionist government, but somebody that is going to be withdrawing. So that part of it is right. So I think his point is that while structural reforms are fine and dandy, you need to have a certain sequencing and you need to prioritize certain things now and certain things later. So obviously, it is a very unexceptionable statement to make.
Dr. Roy, you went offline for a bit, but I think so. The debate was, what do you do in terms of what is called reforms? Okay. So you heard the conversation. So just as an extension of that, reforms is a consequence of crisis. If one looks back to 1991, what was changed after the crisis had a link into what the crisis came out of. Here, if one were to look at certain reforms that are needed as learnings from this crisis, what would be relevant to your mind?
You don't learn from a disaster management crisis, do you?
Why? You could say we need increased health spending, for instance.
That's a no-brainer. So done. Next, what do I say?
Urban jobs guarantee, for instance. Worth thinking about.
That was asked to earlier. I mean, the fact is, what this crisis tells me is that we were not concerned that the India growth story was all about a bunch of people coming from 2000 regularly, coming 2,000 miles a year, sitting in our faces, working not just as jewelers and in factory shop roles, but as our cooks, maids, drivers, cleaners, and going back 2,000 kilometers. The business of the railways had changed over the last 17 years. I saw no commentary on it. I saw a book by Arvind Adiga, that's about it. There was very little commentary on the macroeconomic implications of this kind of tectonic movement of labor, which begs the question, why is it that industry is not able to locate where the labor is? Surely low wage costs is not the problem in UP. I think recent newspaper events tell you very pointedly what the problem in UP is, and we should learn from that. So I think the lessons we have to learn from this disaster that has hit us is not, we had a crisis, what do we learn from it, reform and go forward. That's a terrible, I think, juxtaposition to make with 1991. The lessons from this crisis, if there are any from this disaster, is that we have already had serious socio-political barriers to growth. Some of them are no-brainers, like our low-wage people are sitting in northern and eastern India. New industry is growing in western and southern India. Why? Second, the recognition that people who work in India are Indians first, and not people who have to be packed off at the first sign of a crisis. And the answer to that is not government should stay. Government should stay, we know, under conditions which did not inspire confidence. So what you saw was a massive breaking of the law, which government could do nothing about. And doing the most fundamental thing possible, walking. It's bigger than anything that happened in 1991. Millions of people walking. That is what we have got to learn from, that when millions of people walk, it tells you that the bedrock of the social process in which your growth is very weak. And that will in turn tell you why you don't have good health care. I think it is a terrible thing that we are saying we must have good healthcare now because all of us are hiding in our homes on webinars saying, oh God, COVID, so I can't go to the bar. Right? The bedrock of it is we have bad healthcare, it needs to get better. And if it got better, then we would not have had this worry about migrant labor moving and affecting our lives. And if we learn that lesson, then we will have an argument that good healthcare is good for the country. It's not just something you do for people. Good education is good for the country. We need to improve the quality of education so that people, understand from that education why mask wearing is important. So a number of lessons you can draw, but I'm afraid they're far more complicated than, oh, we had a crisis, let's take advantage of it. I don't think that happened in 1991 either. That's another story. I think the problem is that we've been hit with a disaster that has shown us the skeletons in our cupboard, the dark spaces in which we have hidden things and pretended this great India growth story is going on well, and all those ET Now seminar, whatever, not ET in particular. You know what I mean? Those big jamborees, you've moderated many of them going on, people wearing ties and suits and, sort of thinking that everything is okay. Everything is not okay. Everything is actually not okay at all. I've been saying this for years with the way the Indian economy is going, and therefore we have to, as a society, do a fundamental rethink, part of which is the output composition change in growth, but part of it is also questions of citizenship, liberty, and fraternity, which have to be fostered within society so that political forces can then take that up and make us more inclusive. That was the China story, a very important part of it, plus dictatorship, which allowed them to suspend somewhat liberties. That was definitely the South Korea story. That was not the Philippines story. That was not the Brazil story. So we have a stark choice. In 2025, forget $5 trillion. You want to be Brazil or Philippines, or you want to be South Korea? This watershed moment has come faster than I expected, and I think we need to have a dialogue to understand how we can shift tracks in a major way to move towards that inclusion, which is the only optimal and sustainable way we can grow better. Automobiles and four-wheelers and Indigo Airlines and Hinova.
Anand?
Well, superb comments from everybody. So I'm going to tie some of your questions together, Ira, along with the comments made by the other panelists. You originally asked, should public spending happen right now, public works, etc., right? As Dr. Roy said, I think it's a no-brainer when it comes to health, education, and maybe even nutrition. Frankly, public spending has to happen. If we keep saying that demographics is going to be our key to our success, etc., we're not spending. And I've seen fantastic presentations from Anant Nageshwar, describing the situation of our healthcare spending, education spending, etc. Clearly, that needs to go up, no questions asked. On other kind of public works, now hark back to 2008, when we were coming out of the global financial crisis, and mind you, we were not impacted directly. The panacea was seen as large fiscal spending, followed by large public-private partnerships towards infrastructure. You can call it telephone banking, etc., but this was the gist that we'll put into large infrastructure works. It didn't work. And I'll again go back to what Dr. Roy was saying. Let's not learn lessons from COVID-19. COVID-19 is out of syllabus, once in 100 years situation, let's keep it aside. Let's look at the lessons we learned from the years before that, the 10 years before that. And there are some stark situations that we have to recognize out here. In fact, again, referring to the presentation I saw from Dr. Anant, why is our worker participation rate 35%? Why is it that only 17% of our GDP is contributed by women? Why is it that even now 44% of our workforce is into agriculture? I think we have to accept the stark reality, which is that we've been doing a terrible job of creating jobs and output for the last many, many years. It's not a one government, two government thing. It's been going on for many, many years. Now, we need a medium-term strategy to get us out of this rut, where we get into a virtuous cycle where money creation can happen alongside supply creation, alongside job creation, alongside consumption. We need that virtuous cycle. And it's not going to happen overnight. It requires a lot of hard work. In my mind, there are three elements which are required. One, even before COVID-19, and you and I have had lots of arguments on this, Ira, the state of our financial services ecosystem was in no shape to fund the growth that we require, our growth aspirations. That's number one, that requires a complete overhaul. Second, besides and linked to the financial sector, lots of other sectors, power, real estate, telecom, airline and shipping, these have been facing chronic stresses, which are, frankly, the can has been kicked down the road on all of them for many, many years now. And we're just sort of pretending that the story doesn't exist, the bad story doesn't exist. The third part is what Prime Minister Modi referred to in his Atmanirbhar speech, which is if you want ease of investments, and it doesn't matter, and you're right about this exports fascination. It could be for Make for India, it could be for Make in India, it doesn't matter. We need jobs, simple, right? But if you need to create jobs and output, you need lots of reforms. He referred to them as terms, land reform, labor reform, laws, liquidity, and supply chains from China, all of that. But these are tough. These are not easy reforms to get done. And all these three put together, financial sector, other sectors, and ease of investments for jobs and output, these are boil the ocean changes, call them second generation reforms, whatever you call them. And it requires a huge amount of coordination amongst multiple stakeholders. I think we can get at. The good news is lots of committees and commissions, which these gentlemen have been part of as well, have given good recommendations on what needs to be done for each of these areas. So the prescriptions are all there. Implementation is the problem. And the problem I see currently, why I'm not convinced that we are on the path of reforms as yet, I think we need three elements for these reforms to go through. You need political leadership with a clear vision. You need empowered experts who are actually leading the charge as well. And you need a very efficient bureaucracy. At the moment, when I see the announcements coming out, whether the 5-part announcements or the marathon speech given by a finance minister, they all bear the stamp of the bureaucracy. We don't have enough empowered experts. We don't have enough vision and leadership coming in on the economic side from the political leadership as yet. If we get these three elements, I think all these problems I listed out have solutions. No reason why we can't make progress on them. Sorry, I took a lot of time.
Dr. Naresan, how do we get those three? Bureaucracy reform, I think, has been spoken about for a while. I'm sure it's far easier said than done. But empowered experts, we have committees, we have Niti Aayog's replacements of planning commission, etc. So I mean that infrastructure, brick and mortar, seems to be in place, but it's not working.
So I guess sometimes when the problem looks very highly intractable, as it does, because the political economy of this is quite formidable, then it is good to break it down into small parts and begin somewhere and send a message that you will get to the more difficult elements. So, for example, one way to signal that would be to say we will first start by fixing India's, Dr. Sen would be the person to answer that, fixing the credibility of the Indian statistics. He pointed out in his beautiful 5-part series how post-demonetization growth rate appeared to be much better than the previous years because of the fact that you inferred the informal sector's contribution from the formal sector, which happened to gain from demonetization, and therefore appeared to give a false sense of actually things were looking better. So when you have an idiosyncratic shock that was not transmitted throughout the economy, then these approximations broke down from formal to informal. So you need to fix the credibility of the economic statistics, both at the central level and the state level. And if you start with that, that itself will then lead you to understanding the problems better. And then one by one, you can sort of lead to a situation where you draw in experts who are not politically, controversial for you, acceptable, and who have multiple perspectives. So I would say break down complex problems into smaller elements and start from the one that sends a credible signal about your commitment, and then you move on, because obviously there are no templates in this situation. I mean, today's developed countries did not grow on the basis of planned economies, on the basis of governments guiding them what to do. So I think the overall principle of somehow letting the entrepreneurial spirit of the country being unleashed is fair. But the government has a role to play in knowing which areas it needs to step away from and which areas it needs to fix. So giving that clarity will be a very good starting point.
Dr. Roy, you want to throw in a view there?
No, I completely agree. And I agree that there are real political economy constraints. I'll just leave your audience with a hint. In what country of the world is it the case that the senior executive service that we call the IAS or IPS, let's take the IPS, the educational qualifications to apply for a competitive exam to become an IPS officer are exactly the same as for a sub-inspector of police? That should tell you something. That should tell you something about what exactly we are doing when we are recruiting a civil service. And then to talk about lateral entry and things like that misses the point to some extent. This is a big takeaway when I was in the pay commission. So I agree with Anand. We need to have bite-sized chunks that we need to look at. But I think we also need to recognize something. And again, this relates to COVID. But I had a lot of problems with the planning commission. chiefly as a fiscal guy, when I found that the Planning Commission was spending more on revenue expenditure than capital expenditure, and that the biggest spender on capital expenditure was non-plan expenditure because of the defense ministry. So the state of affairs was obtained 13 years ago when I was in the 13th Finance Commission. I said, this is rubbish. And for the book I'm writing, I've just been going through the finance minister's speeches, and you can see that people stopped taking planning seriously sometime in the early 80s. So it was long overdue to change, but then there were two things there, which was one, collaborative ecosystem operations. For better or worse, the Planning Commission was doing that simply because it had an all-India conversation going at the level of the states. It also had an all-India conversation going, all-global conversation going with the policy ecosystem, which had not to be directly pertinent to the issue immediately at hand, unlike the case of the finance ministry. Today, if you want to talk to the revenue department, they'll have a global conversation on GST wide fail, or they'll have a conversation on the mess that revenue is in. If you ask them, why is it that you are unable to forecast taxes? You can only provide estimates, not even projections. They're not interested. Planning Commission could do that, you see. So there was a sort of room there for expertise to gather, even if you had a low opinion of anyone in the Planning Commission except Dr. Kannan Singh. There was room there for gathering of expertise. That has gone. Today, there is no room to gather expertise in the Niti Aayog. The Niti Aayog essentially produces some very bright ideas produced by some very bright young people, and then they vanish. Their attempt at producing a strategic plan for India, which is what they were engaged in for 3 of the past 5 years of the regime, has been an abject failure. And there is no alternative where there is some strategic planning done. So today, if I'm going to, and it's also, by the way, we've all got used to this, it's like opium. The media is only interested in the budget. The moment I say medium-term framework, their eyes glaze over. Because they don't
That's
want
not true. That's not true at all. You and I have had conversations about the medium-term framework.
And I think you're the only person who I've had a conversation with in the entire media who has taken this notion seriously. And it goes back to being a grown-up economy. See, in a grown-up economy, you should have the guts, which is patently lacking at the moment, and this is a big problem in our current crisis management, to say that on the basis of the argument I'm going to give you, this is what I forecast tax revenues to be in 3 years, not what I estimate or what I project. This is what I forecast is going to happen to GDP growth. If you just say, oh, let's do $5 trillion economy and then work down, that's like going back to old-fashioned planning and very bad planning at that, because you're not looking at capital output ratios, you're not asking what production consumption would be. So we as a society seem to have lost confidence in our own future, is the signal I get, from our increasing unwillingness to talk about the medium term. If we are able to do that as a society, then we will be able to direct our bureaucracy to talk about the medium term. Our politicians will then be inspired to talk about the medium term. I think it is a fundamental error to say of all politicians that they're only interested in getting elected the next time. That's not my experience of politicians. Really good politicians want to be in the history books. They want to be up there with Napoleon in the footlights. They may succeed or they may fail, but they know that being in the history books, you need to get elected, but you also need to deliver something in the medium term. That was the difference, I think, between, let's say, statesmen like Mr. Vajpayee or Mr. Mandela and others. That you wanted to leave a legacy of history. You could be successful or unsuccessful. So that reclaiming we have to do if we are going to achieve what Anand correctly said are the very formidable challenges before us. We have to have faith that we have a bright future and the courage to spell out how we are going to get there. Not just targets, a plan in this sense.
Okay. We're about 10 odd minutes before we wrap up, and I'm going to lean on a question from Arvind Chari, who's, follows the economy quite well. But he says that he wants, and I fully agree with him, to have all of you put on the spot and say, if you were the finance secretary or the finance minister, what would be the 5 things that you would do? And I'm hoping somewhere in the middle, somebody will mention the Indonesia experience, because the conversation veered away.
Mention what?
Get to have a chance. Dr. Pranav Sen, the question being, if you were the finance minister / finance secretary right now, what would be the 5 things that you would want?
Well, I don't know if I can tick off 5, but what I would do, number 1, reverse. First step, reverse the order that the finance minister has already given, which is all new projects be put on hold. That's number 1. Get them off the ground and get them off now, because ministries have spent 2 to 3 years in preparing these. The background work is done, the approvals are there, just get on with it. Number 2, identify projects, where you can ramp up your expenditures quickly and substantially. NREGS is one, but there is a limitation there, which comes from state finances, which I'm not going to go into, but there is an issue there. But things like rural roads, things like micro and mini irrigation, things like rural and urban housing, these are all approved projects, and it's just a question of going ahead. Number 3, announce a major program for the upgradation of all health centers across the country. All, not just the hospitals, but the PHCs and the sub-centers as well. Number 4, announce a major program of urban renewal. Take advantage of the fact that you had a very large number of migrants who have left the cities. The pressure on our urban spaces is relatively less today. Start the process before these people come back, and then you have to go through the absolutely heartbreaking process of displacing them from their homes. 5th, please, for God's sake, spend over and above what you budgeted for, something like 5 lakh crores.
And monetize it.
I don't care how you finance it. You may not have to monetize all of it. You'll have to monetize, in my estimate, about 3 to 3.5 lakh crores.
Dr. Roy, 5 things.
I'd rather say that the first thing I'd do is seek a transfer to the Prime Minister's office, the way things are going nowadays in the Finance Ministry. But assuming that we were in a Finance Ministry that was actually, making policy.
No, sorry, I didn't hear you well.
I said the first thing I would do if I was Finance Secretary is seek a transfer to the Prime Minister's office. Since clearly policy is made there, it would so appear to me. But failing that, if I was the Operational Finance Ministry, the first thing I would do is, first I would improve communication. The first thing I would communicate is this. I'm not going to worry about how much I spend until I tell you, the public of India, what I'm going to spend on over the next 3 years, and I'm going to commit and be accountable to what that is going to do to improve the state of the economy. I will communicate that first. I'd call it my 3-year spending battle plan. And we can differ on what you spend on. We have seen resonances on that. And I would try and come to a view, taking professional advice on what it is we should spend on, whether we do public works programs or whether we ramp up healthcare, or do both, and in what measure. And then I would present number 2, a calibrated spending program saying, 1, I will get this money in year T+2 by the recovery of tax revenues I will get from my spending program. Incident to that recovery, I would immediately have COVID-specific bonds, consoles. Need I elaborate? I won't. Consoles are basically, for the audience, bonds that you pay the interest on, and I would suggest you pay an attractive rate of interest, but you do so you pay the principal is in principle repayable only in perpetuity. I decide when I repay you, but you keep getting the interest. Okay, it's a perpetual. And by the way, I thought of this before the European Union. Added to that, I would make sure that the cash note of approximately 1 to 1.5 trillion rupees that is scattered around different Government of India bank accounts, not in treasury, is mobilized. I would then see what the incremental remainder I need, what I can get from vanilla borrowing in due course, which would be more short-term and marketable, and what I can get from privatization in years T. See, you only think of year T+1 privatization is impossible. If I'm thinking of T+1 to T+3, privatization is possible. So there is investment receipts coming. And if it's a matter of gearing between years T+1 and T+3, if I had a medium-term framework, I'd use a multi-period WME. So I'm only giving you 4 places to find money. That's my job. I'm a fiscal expert. Then I worry about this thing that seems to obsess everybody, monetization. Relax. There's lots you have to do, but first you have to tell me what I'm going to spend the money on, what is it going, when is it going to get you payback. We do it in a 3 to 5 year framework. There is enough fiscal instrumentation. If it's a matter of liquidity management across 3 to 5 years to do it, as an extraordinary case in a multi-period pay, we need not be tied to the annual calendar. That's 3 steps. The 4th step I would do is immediately and instantly commit that every further regulation issued regarding the private sector, credit management, etc., by either the RBI, since I am on the board, or the Ministry of Finance, or the Ministry of Commerce, or any other entity who goes around shooting off these ungrammatical regulations, commits to a time frame in which this regulation will not be altered and that time frame cannot be less than 18 months. Cannot be. It is a bad and weak government that has to regulate, constantly tinker and alter its regulations repeatedly. This has been going on for too long. There are accusations this is done due to nepotism. I think a lot of it is just incompetence, and that has got to stop. And I'll find out why I'm not able to do it, and then if I needed to bring in expertise to do it, I would do so. And the final thing that I would commit in the finance ministry is to a transparent conversation regarding the three big issues of our time. Why is it that my economy's growth was slowing before COVID? It's essential equipment to write that medium-term plan. Number two, why are my tax receipts stagnating irrespective of whether I grow fast or whether I grow slow? Number three, to what extent is it important for me to acknowledge that my expenditure management systems are poor, and by what time frame will I come out with a plan that will give you metrics that will show that government will spend its money more effectively and more efficiently? And number five, I would start a conversation headed by the defense minister, if the finance minister would be so kind, on how to use government land to make India slum-free, because that's also an aspect, that's also a resource. I would start a conversation, I repeat, with the defense minister, with the vice chair being the railway minister, on how to use central government land to deliver a slum-free India in the metropolitan areas by 2023.
Both fabulous. Dr. Nageshwaran, you want to add to that or pick up on any of those points, a combination of them?
No, I will add to them, but I will probably be expanding the question to the remit of the government and not just the finance minister or the finance secretary. So I would start by saying that the government of India will do away with income tax assessment and will rely on the existing mechanisms of TDS, advance tax, and for people to make tax payments, because 92% of the direct taxes come from voluntary compliance, and there is enough data with the government to ensure that it doesn't drop off the cliff. So doing away with income tax assessment will be a very good signal to the public, businesses and people about the ease of doing business, ease of living in the country. The second would be, I would give a 3-month time frame to restore, even if it means restating the growth rates of some of the years, to restore macroeconomic data credibility of the states and the union macro data, the country level macro data. And the third thing I would do would be to, as you know, Anant and I have been privately discussing several times, to use this opportunity to appoint a crack team of experts from different disciplines, serving and former bureaucrats and experts in other fields, which will report to the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, an empowered committee, and that will make decisions. That will be number 3. Number 4, using the opportunity of the global value chains, trying to relocate out of China, call directly the top 20 businesses which are looking to move out of China. Ask them a couple of questions. What is it that would make you move to India? And find out what is the time frame that they are willing to give India. And then open up this idea to different states and ask them which state is ready to deliver on these, and then create a competition among them. And that would be a very credible way of going about attracting companies to relocate to India. My 4th suggestion would be to organize a conclave of state chief ministers or the finance ministers or both, and agree on just three important reforms, and ensure that it is time bound, it is deliverable, it is monitorable, on whether it is land or power, or whether it is water or education or health. Choose any 3 and then report on them. The 5th one would be, as a finance person, I would agree to cap the cess in the total revenues of the union government, because while the official shareable portion has been increasing, but the cess portion has been rising much faster, which is not shared with the state. So I would commit to cap the cess in the total revenue of the union government, and also come out with the firm settlement of the GST compensation cess. These would be the 5 things to do.
Anant, to you for your 5, but also I'll request you to, after that, perhaps help us wrap up the conversation.
You'll do the wrapping up, Ira. So I'll stop. Great. Look, fantastic suggestions. So very difficult to come up with new ones, but I'll tell you what I would do. First, I'm an armchair professor. I don't have to do anything. So I'll just dream on and go, like Anant said, which is go beyond finance secretary to a higher level. First, on COVID-19, we don't know how long this is going to go on. Be prepared to provide whatever relief is required, both to the workforce, to people, and to small businesses. Don't worry about the fisc. What needs to be provided has to be provided. So that's point number one. Be ready to spend when required. Having said that, the next parts will be about a medium-term plan, the one that Dr. Roy referred to, which is you have to have a plan of how you go beyond COVID-19, right? There I would do the following. First, I would look at the financial services ecosystem. It is in no shape, even before COVID-19, to fund our growth aspirations. I would rope in experts, like Anand said, I would rope in experts. You take names, Uday Kotak, Deepak Parekh, you name it. There are enough number of good people who can be roped in for all of these big long-term measures. But for the banking and the financial sector system, you probably need a one-time solution for the NPAs. IBC and NCLT are good, but they're not enough. You also need banking reforms like PGNI committee reforms. You also need governance reforms. You also need market reforms. All of that entire financial services ecosystem cleanup has to happen. Next, when you look at the other sectors which are chronically stressed, power, real estate, telecom, airline and shipping, get in experts again, empower them, ask them to tell you how to solve these issues, lock up those people, all the stakeholders in one room, state government, central government, secretaries, and so on and so forth. Don't open the door until they've come out with a solution, right? And don't kick the can down the road. So clean up that entire mess of those stressed out sectors. Fine. The fourth part would be what we talked about, ease of doing investments, creating jobs and output. And this is going to be tough. Again, you need multiple stakeholders. You need experts. You need central government, state governments. Get in the Foxcons. Get in the the Boeings and the Lockheed Martins to give you inputs. Your own domestic investors, ask them to give inputs and make changes to ease investments and therefore create jobs and output. The last fifth bit, I think one lesson we have to take away, the need to invest in healthcare, education, and nutrition. Bhutto was fond of saying, even if you have to eat grass, we'll create a nuclear bomb in response to our nuclear test, right? Our motto has to be, even if we have to eat grass, we have to give our children education, healthcare, and nutrition. I think that has to be our motto completely. So these would be the 5 things. Again, armchair professor, so I can say whatever I want. Back to you, Ira.
Yeah, thanks so much, actually. Excuse me, all of those suggestions have been very, very useful. I'll just wrap up by saying that we've had a chance to discuss the near term. I won't try and sum up what all the experts have said. I'll goof up in a monumental way. All I'll say is that we do have an immediate problem, which I think everyone agrees is not been adequately tackled. That needs to be certainly done, but we also need to start thinking about medium-term frameworks for the country's growth, with a reminder to ourselves that we were slowing even before we hit this crisis, and there are some useful suggestions across different areas from the experts. Thank you all so much, and I'm sorry we couldn't take all of the questions that came through, but it was a very interactive panel. There are lots of interesting comments on the site. We will all go through in the recording and take note of some of your suggestions. I'll wrap it up there. Anand.
Thanks a lot, Ira. On behalf of SPJMR and CFS, thank you, Ira. Thank you, Dr. Pranab Sen. Thank you, Dr. Atin Roy. And thank you, Anant Nageshwaran. Fantastic panel discussion. We should do this more often. And this is extremely enriching and a lot of fun, to be honest. So thank you again, Ira. And back to all of you.
Yes, Ira. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Enjoyed being part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll probably all agree that you're the favorite anchor.
Absolutely.
Banker? You just
Anchor.
I'm not sure I take that as a compliment right now, but thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys. Cheers.
Okay, thanks a lot. Take
Bye-bye.
care.